Profane woke up early in the morning, covered in a thin layer of snow and feeling the onset of a bad cold. He blundered down the ladder's ice-covered rungs, slipping about every other step. The ship was deserted. He headed down below decks to get warm. Again, he was in the guts of something inanimate. Thomas Anderson has said that he was going to steal a scene from V by Thomas Pynchon for his film, The Master, but that the storyline was eventually scrapped. Now, Paul Thomas Anderson went on to adapt Inherent Vice by Thomas Pynchon, and there are rumors circulating that he might do Vineland by Thomas Pynchon next. So it's safe to say that Paul Thomas Anderson is inspired by Thomas Pynchon's writing. But I think not enough has been said about the influence that V had on The Master. In addition to their almost identical premises, both V and The Master ask a very grave postmodern question about what it means to be human. If our narratives are just these made-up stories to tell ourselves about who we are, then are we just sacks of meat? Are we inanimate machines driven by our animal impulses? Each story answers this question in its own way, and on their own, each story is a beautiful work of art. But I'm going to argue that V had a greater influence on The Master than just a potential scene that didn't make it into the film. Now, I'm not saying that every connection I make between V and The Master is the result of a conscious, deliberate choice by Paul Thomas Anderson trying to work elements of the novel into the film. But it can be very rewarding to analyze both stories in tandem, whether or not these connections were unconscious or coincidental. It's possible that both stories were pulling from the same cosmic pool of ideas that were trying to manifest in specific works of art. Maybe the secrets of the origin of both stories is buried along with the secrets of Viesu. Also, if you want to support me in any way, please consider reading my book, Lionel Lancet and the Right Vibe. I've been told that it's funny, trippy, psychedelic, and also a quick read. Also, please consider listening to my most recent EP. You can find that here on YouTube or basically on any streaming service. Here's a clip of it now. Alright, so first of all, the protagonists in both stories have a lot of similarities, but I want to clear up, there's not like a one-to-one relationship between Benny Profane and Freddie Quill.
Yes, that's right.
Both V and The Master start with their protagonists, recently discharged from the Navy and aimlessly bouncing from job to job.
You told me you're an able-bodied seaman and you're looking for work.
Both protagonists are not guided by higher principles or a story about their life that would give them a sense of order or meaning. They're driven by their base animal impulses. This is an explicit theme for Freddie in The Master, whose violent outbursts and promiscuity establish his impulsiveness and reactivity right away. And in processing, we learn that Freddie is not driven by a sophisticated dream or religion or anything bigger than himself.
Oh, sure.
Yes, you do.
He just does what his animal impulses tell him to do. The whole story is about Dodd trying to teach Freddie to transcend his animalism so he can better himself. Or in Dodd's words,
"We are, all of us, working at breakneck speeds and in unison towards capturing the mind's fatal flaws and correcting it back to its inherent state of perfect."
Dodd seems to be Freddie's opposite at first. He's characterized as refined and romantic and intellectual. But one of the most compelling aspects of the film is watching Dodd's animalism creep out.
If you already know the answers to your questions, then why ask? Pig fuck!
Benny Profane is similarly aimless in V. After getting discharged from the Navy, he is yo-yoing up and down the coast, bouncing from job to job. As his highly evocative name suggests, he is profane, which means non-religious or irreverent. He doesn't interpolate himself into a grand narrative or a story about history that might give his life meaning and direction and lift him out of his profane existence. As Pynchon calls him, Benny Profane is a schlemiel, a stupid, awkward, unfortunate person. While Pynchon doesn't characterize Benny as animalistic to the degree that Freddie is in The Master, other characters in the first chapter of V might have inspired Freddie's animalism and the theme of animalism in The Master in general. For example, Pynchon describes an unruly engine man named Ploy who swings like an orangutan, and there's Pig Bodine, who's described as foul, horribly obscene, and whose name is literally Pig. But even if Benny and Freddie aren't characterized in the same exact way, both seem to represent what a man is in the absence of meaning or a higher purpose. For Freddie and The Master, a man without meaning is an animal.
Silly animal.
But Pynchon seems to explore the implications of Benny's nihilism by reducing him to a machine. To Profane alone in the street, it would always seem maybe he was looking for something too to make the fact of his own disassembly plausible as that of any machine. There's also a pattern in the text of characters with missing limbs and prosthetics, and some truly amazing passages about plastic surgery and dentistry, and this invites us to see ourselves as machines, but also as a ship of Theseus to a certain degree. The dentistry scene in particular, where Pynchon describes how dentistry has replaced psychoanalysis, I interpret as a playful speculation that if all of our psychology and the content of our human interior is just bullshit since we're machines, then really the only thing you need as a machine in the 20th century is physical maintenance, such as orthodontia. And other imagery in the novel supports this, such as Shock and Shroud, which are these crash test dummy-like creations from Anthro Research and Associates. Across one of the laboratory spaces, features lit Frankenstein's monster-like by a nightlight, facing Profane, sat Shroud, synthetic human, radiation output determined. Profane still felt a certain kinship with Shock, which was the first inanimate schlemiel he'd ever encountered. Alright, so far I've pointed out some interesting connections between V and the Master. Just to recap, they have a very similar premise of a man being discharged from the Navy and bouncing from job to job, and they also explore a very similar theme of what is a man in the absence of meaning. They do answer this question in different ways. In The Master, it's more about man being reduced to a beast or an animal, and in V, man becomes a machine, who is easily disassembled or torn apart. But in order to understand the headspace that Paul Thomas Anderson might have been in when he was developing The Master, we've got to do a deeper dive on V. V is about the myths, legends, and apocryphal stories that guide people and history. One of the ways that Pynchon plays with this is depicting a postmodern society that has inherited so many stories and so much history from everything that came before that every single object and human is almost subsumed by their capacity to represent something from a story or from history.
You seem so familiar to me.
And I think this helps us understand the very meaningful and even silly names that Pynchon uses for his characters. In V alone, we have Profane, Pig, Owlglass, Stencil, Eigenvalue. Everything has the capacity to represent something, whether it wants to or not. I think that this pattern of hypersymbolism is itself an abstraction that's depicted in a symbol, the letter V. Overhead, turning everybody's face green and ugly, shone mercury vapor lamps, receding in an asymmetric V to the east, where it's dark and there are no more bars. So in that image of the V receding in the streetlights over the horizon in Benny's perception, I think Pynchon depicts the idea of a discrete thing, a discrete moment, a discrete instance, receding into abstraction. And Pynchon gives us an example of this explicitly in this same paragraph. After that long of more named pavements than he'd care to count, Profane had grown a little leery of streets, especially streets like this. They had in fact all fused into a single abstracted street, which come the full moon he would have nightmares about. It's almost as if the particular street he's on is just an iteration of an abstract street, or an ideal street. And right after this, Benny enters a bar and encounters Beatrice, who just like the street is both an individual but also a representation of an abstraction. "Benny," she cried. They became tender, meeting again after so long. Profane began to draw in the sawdust, hearts, arrows through them, seagulls carrying a banner in their beaks which read, "Dear Beatrice." Mrs. Buffo, owner of the Sailor's Grave, whose first name was also Beatrice, had a theory that just as small children call all females mother, so sailors, in their way, equally as helpless, should call all barmaids Beatrice. Further to implement this maternal policy, she had had custom beer taps installed made of foam rubber in the shape of large breasts. From 8 to 9 on payday nights, there occurred something Mrs. Buffo called suck hour. What ensues is a stampede of servicemen all climbing and fighting over each other to get a suckle of the breast beer tap, while Profane watches the conflict from the side with a damsel wrapped around his leg, too profane to participate in the game. But what exactly is the game? In V, it's that humans interpolate their unconscious drives for sex and power into myths and narratives. But these stories have weight, so even if they're apocryphal or no more real than dreams, they influence and guide us as individuals and as a society. It's a pretty abstract theme, but other examples from the novel illuminate this pattern in the text. So even though Profane isn't consciously guided by a mythic narrative about life or history, He ends up playing a role in an apocryphal story when he goes beneath street level to hunt alligators. And this is the scene that Paul Thomas Anderson was planning on putting in The Master. After establishing that the street is this abstracted street in Benny's dream, or nightmares, to go below the street to hunt reptilian pests lurking around the city might be an image that amounts to descending into his own unconscious to confront his animal drives. But the text tells us that his journey in the sewers follows the apocryphal story of Father Fearing, a priest who supposedly led a congregation of rats in the sewers of New York. And some of these rats are depicted as incredibly intelligent, asking pointed, difficult questions that challenge Father Fearing about the nature of indulgences in the Catholic Church. And one rat named Veronica wants to get canonized as a saint, and Father Fearing is like, oh, I'll have to write to the bishop. Father Fearing actually falls in love with this rat and apparently consummates his love with her and refers to her as V. Oh, and one more detail, Father Fearing eats members of his congregation when he needs to. And if it's not obvious from these absurd details, you're supposed to take the story of Father Fearing as a myth. And Pynchon tells us this explicitly on page 125. The stories, by the time Profane heard them, were pretty much apocryphal and more fantasy than record itself warranted. It is this way with sewer stories. They just are. Truth and falsity don't apply. Furthermore, the area of New York where Profane is hunting alligators is historically German. It's Yorkville and the Upper East Side. And the boss of the Alligator Hunter Patrol, his last name is Zeitzis, and he has all of his patrolmen wear armbands. So even though this imagery evokes Nazi Germany to the reader, to Profane, it evokes Father Fearing's story. On page 128, Pynchon writes, in Independence Hall in Philly, when the floor was rebuilt, they left parts of the original, a foot square, to show the tourists. Maybe, the guide would tell you, Benjamin Franklin stood right here, or even George Washington. Profane, on an 8th grade class trip, had been suitably impressed. He got that feeling now. I'm sorry, he told the alligator. He was always saying he was sorry. It was a Schlemiel's stock line. He raised the repeater to his shoulder, flickered off the safety. Sorry, he said again. Father Fearing talked to rats. Profane talked to alligators. He fired. So even though the Father Fearing story is obviously fake, even within the world of the novel, it still manages to give shape, order, and meaning to an experience that Profane might otherwise see as meaningless and chaotic. But I think the main takeaway from this scene is that Benny is using an absolutely ridiculous story to understand his experience killing something. But further iterations of this theme in the novel underscore the gravity and historical scale of people using stories and legends in order to understand our unconscious drives for sex and power. In one of the most haunting sections, the occupying class of German colonial Southwest Africa commit genocide, following in the footsteps of von Trotha, a real historical figure who led a horrific campaign against the Hereros and Namas in 1904, where it's estimated that more than 100,000 people were killed. The occupiers depicted in V in 1922 elevated the history of 1904 as a mythic past to aspire to. Not only do they throw parties and revere it like a holiday, they sexualize it and use it to iterate their fundamental human drives on a mass scale through the machine technology of modern warfare, which is the theme that he goes on to render in hysterical, nightmarish detail in Gravity's Rainbow. The reader accesses these scenes through a character named Stencil and one of his various impressions of the past, and they're impressions because Pynchon's saying that they're flawed accounts of the truth. A stencil imposes form or shape onto undifferentiated space, or it can create a pattern where there is none. And something that keeps coming up in these accounts is the letter V, in characters' names, paintings, cities, including the myth of Viesu. Viesu was my favorite part of V when I first read it. It's a legend passed down from father to son about a lost world with iridescent spider monkeys and a whole landscape of shifting colors, cities inside of volcanoes, and women who only give birth to triplets. This is Pynchon inserting some elements of the Lost World genre, a genre of books and eventually movies that eventually gave us Indiana Jones and Jurassic Park. In these stories, Europeans go on wild adventures in other countries, and it's just full of fun, and they usually discover treasure and fantastical monsters and indigenous magic. But this subgenre of adventure fiction just so happens to coincide with European colonialism, where Europeans were absolutely going to other countries, but it was far from the adventures depicted in the fictional stories. They were committing atrocities on a mass scale. Viesu turns out to be nothing more than a dream of annihilation, and likewise, the scenes in German colonial Southwest Africa devolve into layers of embedded stories, where you, the reader, are reading V, a story about the late 1950s, with a character named Stencil, who's getting the story from the 1920s in German colonial South Africa, about a researcher who begins to inhabit the consciousness of a soldier in von Trotha's army in 1904. The investigation of narratives and legends and how they drive people in V is an influence on the character Lancaster Dodd. All of Dodd's stories about past lives and the possibility of perfecting humans is bullshit.
He's making all this up as he goes along.
The final scenes between Freddy Quill and Lancaster Dodd is a confrontation of two major themes in V, and it's in this scene that we learn where Lancaster Dodd thinks he remembers Freddy Quill from. It was from a past life.
We worked and rigged balloons.
Before encountering Lancaster Dodd, Freddy Quill is violent and impulsive, but after learning that his past love has moved on, he has a quiet moment to himself and he just accepts it. Furthermore, when Freddy Quill is in bed with that woman at the end of the movie, he isn't there just for carnal desires. In fact, he engages the woman he's in bed with in processing, just like Lancaster Dodd did to him. It doesn't matter if the narratives that transformed Freddy are true. What's important is that they helped him tame his animal impulses. He doesn't fly off the handle anymore, and he actually has a loving moment with this woman. Now, once again, it's obvious that the Master and V take these themes of animalism versus narratives that help us understand our animalism in two pretty different directions. But I think it's undeniable that maybe with a paranoid critical reading, you can see so many similarities between V and the Master that I didn't even mention in this video. Once again, I couldn't guarantee that Paul Thomas Anderson intended all of this, but let's take Paul Thomas Anderson's intention out of it for a second. Assuming that the Master and V just fell out of the sky, I think it's obvious that they were cooking with the same cosmic soup. So if you've made it to this point in the video, I hope that you're encouraged to reread V and then watch the Master right afterwards so that you can see all the connections that I picked up on and maybe some that I didn't. Lastly, please check out Lionel Lancet and the Right Vibe if you want to support me in any way, listen to my album, and maybe send this video to somebody who likes Paul Thomas Anderson or Thomas Pynchon. Thank you so much. Have a good day.